Hi, it's Craig and Richard here for the third weekly feedback video, and some lots of interesting stuff, and in some ways, getting into more challenging aspects of practicing mindfulness, and that's one of the reasons we say that this is not introductory course, because you really do need some basic skills to deal with it. One of the things that came up a lot this week was around self-compassion versus self-criticism, and this is becoming obvious to many learners.
Well, it's a good thing to notice, isn't it, Craig? Yeah. That default setting that a lot of us have, most of us actually, I think, to be self-critical when we're facing challenges.
Yes.
Even when we're feeling emotional or distressed, a lot of us tend to be very tough on ourselves. And so once we start to notice that happening, we're not just automatically playing it out. And we can also perhaps start to notice some of the costs, some of the consequences of doing that.
To notice the effect of being self-critical.
Yeah, on our mood and our self-esteem. And, often we're using it to motivate ourselves, to improve ourselves, or to avoid making mistakes, but we end up making more mistakes, or we end up actually sapping our own self-esteem when we do that. So,
because it's a kind of form of distraction, a sort of a default mode to be in our heads, criticising, judging, commenting.
Well, we're by definition not focused on what's actually happening on the present, are we? We're lost in our thoughts.
Yeah, and not generating that kind of curiosity rather than criticism. And I think one of the curious things that happens is that we become more mindful. We start to notice the recurring pattern of criticism. And then the mind's next thing is to start criticising the criticising. Like, why do I criticise? What's wrong with me? Why do I? Yeah. And it's just the same thing, but it just sort of takes another step back.
Another layer out.
Yeah.
So to notice that we're doing that, let go of the self-critical thoughts and just pay attention to what's happening. Even that's an act of self-compassion. Yeah. But then we can start to actually be kinder to ourselves, to offer ourselves reassurance, to give ourselves permission to make mistakes or to feel emotional or to be having the experience that we're having.
Yes.
And we mentioned a lot of research that shows it's a very powerful thing to do.
Yeah, and the senses, remembering that, are always the gateway back to the present moment.
Yes.
So just walking down the street, we'll just come back to the tactile experience of walking. With a colleague, then just coming back to the looking, the hearing. And so it's like the way through that default sort of habitual mental activity.
That's right. And Kristen Neff's research talks about self-compassion actually being more adaptive in a lot of ways than self-esteem. And one of our learners asked, why do schools focus so much on building self-esteem if that's the case? Yeah. And I think the answer is because they maybe just aren't aware of the research. There was a big movement in the 80s, I think, and 90s around building self-esteem, and that was seen as sort of one of the best things that you could do for kids. But I mean, I guess it depends on how you think about self-esteem, but quite often it's about performance and it's about your position relative to other people. And so then you start to bump into these fallacies, like the fact that everybody needs to be above average to be happy, to have good self-esteem. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense right there. And it can also lead to things like narcissism and bullying. And so there are some negative consequences of that self-esteem tend to sort of get around.
Yes, one of the criticisms sometimes here about mindfulness is, well, that's just, it's navel-gazing, it's being, kind of preoccupied with yourself, it's kind of self-centered, but it's actually quite the opposite. And it's to stop constantly thinking about ourselves, to stop the internal dialogue. And the kind of self-esteem, if we could use that word, that comes about through mindfulness is not thinking about ourselves. There's quite a natural level of self-respect. A kind of a level of awareness, but it's an impartial kind of thing. It's not this sort of, am I good enough or not? Do I have to puff myself up or not? So there's a much more resilient sort of sense of, how should we say, self-respect. Perhaps I'll use that term for it rather than self-esteem.
And a sense of connection to others as well, which is a very important thing, so that we don't feel better than others. We just feel connected to them and part of the human race.
Yeah, because we've got the human condition. I mean, I haven't met anybody who hasn't had the human condition.
Suffering from the human condition.
That's right.
And there's other research as well that our learners found very interesting.
Yeah. Another topic came up as well about perfectionism and tackling this. And it's just consider, for example, how we learn. Like if we want to get better at doing something, if we want to enhance our abilities and our skills and so on, then we do that through paying attention. We do it through exploring and interest and curiosity. And there is something entirely useful about refining what we do. But that comes about through attention. But this kind of perfectionism that's obsessive, that is self-critical, nothing's ever good enough, and so on, is something different. It's associated with a lot of anxiety and a lot of preoccupation, a lot of hesitancy to even start a project.
It makes us feel stressed, activates the stress response, and takes our attention off the activity that we're doing. So it, by definition, I think often leads to things like burnout or actually reduced performance.
Yeah. And just in a kind of a way, it's almost like being like a child, I think, because when a child's learning to walk, a child doesn't import this perfectionistic attitude to it. You know, just the child is constantly refining and improving and developing its balance, and within weeks and months it's doing things it couldn't do before. But that's just through curiosity, that's just through enjoyment. I mean, imagine if a child took a perfectionist attitude to learning to walk. You know, it's like falling over. I'm hopeless.
That didn't work, I suck at this.
I can't do it. Yeah, I can't do it. What's this? You know, and a child would never learn to walk, and it would be paralysing. So yes, by all means, strive for excellence and so on, but do it through enjoyment, do it through perhaps attention and engagement rather than the self-criticism. Yeah. Self-compassion's come up quite a lot too, the importance of, and you mentioned before about Kristen Neff, and there's a question about, can we be too self-compassionate?
Well, look, here again, we'd probably need to separate out self-compassion from things like self-pity, self-indulgence, complacency, giving up. You know, and there's actually a fear of self-compassion scale, which sort of covers all of these, because people naturally, when they hear about self-compassion, think, oh, maybe I'm not going to be as motivated, maybe I'm not going to do as well, you know, maybe I'm going to let people walk all over me. But of course, none of that is compassion. None of that's self-compassion. Self-compassion is about seeing the situation clearly as it is, recognising that it's just human sometimes to fail or experience adversity.
To be curious about the reasons for something happening.
Absolutely. And then to get on with things while at the same time being kind to ourselves rather than being perfectionistic or beating ourselves up or getting lost in a sort of a pity party or anything.
So in a sense, to wish well for ourselves, but to still acknowledge the error.
That's right.
Yeah. I think sometimes people think, oh, too much self-compassion, if there's a kind of complacency, oh, well, it doesn't matter, or I'll just, you know, do everything that's easy and I won't take on any challenges or something like that. And that's not really self-compassion.
No, we mentioned some research about students who are self-compassionate after they fail a test do better on the retest. Not because they let themselves off the hook and watch 2 seasons of Netflix eating a bowl of ice cream. It's because they just accept, look, that sucks, but it's human to fail. And right now, rather than beating myself up, I'm just going to get down to studying. So I'm going to actually get started. I'm going to focus on what I need to focus on, and I'm going to do better.
And what did I learn about avoidance? What did I learn about procrastination? To be better armed for the future. There was questions around as well, tend and befriend. Is it a female trait? Is fight or flight a male trait? Look, there is no polarisation of this. Both men and women have tend and befriend and have fight or flight. But they're both more biologically disposed for one than the other. It's just that the balance perhaps is a bit different. So let's not polarise the view. But certainly those female hormones, and oxytocin in particular probably seems to be the most important one.
Which females have more of?
Have more of, and estrogen. The testosterone tends to accentuate fight or flight, which is not bad if you're going into a fight with a wild tiger or something like that, but if the executive functioning is not working too well, then a particularly male trait can be getting caught in aggression and so on, which is not helpful for oneself or for anybody else.
No, but I think the main and most positive message is that both of us can actually start to activate and hardwire in that tend and befriend response.
That's right.
And get unstuck from the fight and flight response.
Yes, and not to think there's only one that we can have or should have. No. And
which brings us to actually the self-compassion meditations and
always one of the interesting and sometimes challenging practices.
Definitely. And this time around, learners seem to really enjoy them, although they had mixed experiences. Because, of course, the moment we start being kind to ourselves, we start to realise how unkind we've been in the past.
Yes,
and the moment
we're up against old habits and so on.
That's right. Start to notice their self-criticism and the self-judgment. And the moment that we bring a compassionate attitude towards ourselves, we can stay really present with difficulties rather than trying to avoid them. So we actually can get sometimes more in touch with things that perhaps we've been avoiding or unable to be with before. And so our advice, as always, is just to start small. All the time we hear from learners, I tried this with, I visualised the person I've got the most conflict with in the whole world and found that I couldn't, be compassionate with them or myself. And of course, I mean, we're going to think about this like muscles. Mindfulness is a muscle and self-compassion's a muscle, and we build it slowly.
Yes.
And we want to start bit by bit, little bits of meditation, maybe working with someone we have a little bit of conflict or a disagreement with, and building up to the big stuff.
Yes.
And that's a very important thing when we start to practice this.
And being well grounded in the basic meditation practice, day to day, sitting there with the body, with the breath. And we'll have minor, sometimes more significant discomforts and reactions and attitudes. But if we're learning to sit with that, learning to get less caught up in it, then it makes it easier to learn to start to work with these other things.
Yeah.
But this is, not for the faint-hearted.
Not for the faint-hearted.
Have to have some courage and some insight to work with this.
A few more sort of minor topics, Craig.
Yeah.
Mindfulness and pain.
Yeah, pain, just a minor topic. It really doesn't distract. Emotional pain.
Except for anybody actually
pain.
Experiencing pain, perhaps, and then it's anything but a minor topic.
Black
right?
belt mindfulness, the dentist chair. And it's been interesting for a lot of learners to notice that the emotion, the reactivity to the sensation, has the effect of either accentuating it or fixating the attention on it, or helping us to be aware of it but not fixated on it. And so very good to learn to work with that. Some interesting insights there.
Yeah, we could have a whole course on that, couldn't we?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And about rewiring the brain for happiness as well.
Right. Yeah, noticing the negativity bias, cultivating qualities like savouring and gratitude. And I think probably the most promising finding in neuroscience and in some ways in psychology over the last 30 or 40 years is this idea of neuroplasticity. I mean, Aristotle knew that we are what we repeatedly do, right? So it's not kind of a new thing, but we now know that if we practice something, if we cultivate any quality, it gets hardwired into the brain.
Can I quote Shakespeare?
You can feel free. It wouldn't be a course without it.
Well, he wrote, assume a virtue if you have it not. And in a kind of a way...
Fake it till you make it.
Yeah, it's perhaps a more modern take on it.
I think it's a jazz take on it, perhaps, yeah. But at the heart of that is anything that we practice gets hardwired in. So if we're naturally very prone to being caught up in negative kind of thinking, then if we just start to practice things like savouring, gratitude, loving kindness, or cultivating compassion, cultivating friendliness towards ourselves, it really starts to change our brain in very powerful ways. So little practices that's building those muscles I was talking about.
Yes. And just perhaps a couple of things as well. Great that people are getting a sense of the heartfulness, and it was always a part of mindfulness, but mindfulness creates a sort of assumptions about the thinking rather than the feeling.
Focusing in the attention. Yeah.
And so great that many are getting some insights into the importance of heartfulness, which is always underpins it. And about whether or not we get more or less mindful as we get older, well, it depends on what we practice throughout our life, really.
That's exactly right.
We grow in mindfulness or the opposite. I think it is harder for younger people these days, and the connection with the natural environment is not what it perhaps used to be.
That's right. Kids aren't getting
100 years ago.
outside, they're gaming, they're spending too much time using technology, and all of these things, all these distractions take us away from the senses, from the present moment. Yeah. So you're right, it's probably getting harder and harder to actually maintain mindfulness throughout the lifespan.
Yeah, and this is perhaps something, virtual reality will probably find some interesting uses and applications, but from a mindfulness perspective, I wonder if the actual sensory experiences are being subverted by virtual experiences. I'm not sure that's going to be a good thing in the future for developing brains, but they're new frontiers perhaps. So I think we've covered a fair bit for today. Fantastic dialogue on the discussion boards, and thank you to Sherelle and Liv for providing so much fantastic support. And next week will be our final week and mindfulness in our life, and looking at ethics and goals and daily activities.
Just the small picture stuff, really.
Yeah, and how to keep it going in our lives. So we look forward to being with you again next week.